Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Capola, and I'm joined today by a familiar voice to a lot of you, Eric Bond. Eric, do you want to say hello to the nice people?
Hello, nice people. This is Eric Bond.
So, this is going to be the third part in our series on Nicholas II, Nicholas Romanov's assassination. He's not the second. He never makes it to be the second. We've already talked quickly about what that would do. Last episode was what would happen in Europe. And this is a pet project. This is something I really want to do more of, and I really think we should, which is like, there is this huge part of the world which we never really deal with. So I'm really excited to get out of like the same place. So what is kind of today's focus going to be on?
Today, it is all about Asia and a little bit about America, but mostly Asia, Chris.
So completely independent. And this is one of the really interesting things about like the time period we're talking about here, which is all of these things are going off at similar times. And are they independent? If they are, do they create weird little like synergistic things going on? So do you want to go ahead and start? And what happened in our timeline in 1911, which we're going to say held true in this timeline? So go ahead and start in 1911.
How dare you, Chris? You know it's complicated. There's so much to keep track of, but
okay.
I'll sum it up.
All right.
Well, good people. Have you ever had a goal that you were working towards your entire life only to see multiple failures? Well, Sun Yat-sen had that feeling. He had been the instigator for 10 failed revolts against the Qing Empire in China. But it was the 11th one, while he was ironically outside of the country, that would be successful. In 1911, there was a series of local uprisings of military officers and those who wished to reform the Qing state. And essentially, it just kind of caught wildfire, and eventually it spread out. The Chinese Republic was then declared the following year, ideally as a federal republic. That was Sun Yat-sen's main conceit. He wanted to base it off of American lines, but because he had to negotiate with different warlords like Yuan Shikai, he had to make the arrangement of more of a parliamentary system. He surrendered his post as president of the First Republic to Yuan Shikai, not Chiang Kai-shek. I keep wanting to say that, but maybe that'll be in a different episode. For now on, it's Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai would almost immediately usurp the powers of the presidency and try to establish a new empire in China with himself as the emperor.
For I'm going to say our Southwestern audience in the United States, this is something we were discussing a little bit. Maybe I hope this is a little more familiar to you. I'm not going to make any promises. The relationship between Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai seems a little bit like the relationship between Francisco Madero and Victoriano Huerta, in that one of these people is a foreign educated, is a liberal, progressive leader who has these wonderful ideas about what to do with the country, and the other one is a military strongman who makes things happen on the ground. And the idealists trust the wrong person, and it doesn't work out for them. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say it's one of those things that show you can't really ever go off of the what's the name of the principle? The honor system. You can't really count on it for much.
So in this case, though, we have, so just to get back, Yuan Shikai was a military general under the Qing dynasty.
That is correct. And he had made a deal with the revolutionaries of, I can get the Qing to stand down and surrender, but I want a certain number of privileges and a place in the new government, which they agreed to. After Yuan died, a civil war broke out. There were a series of different states, each ran by a local warlord, that eventually settled into a Republic of China, again with Sun Yat-sen at the head. He at this point had kind of hardened and become more embittered towards everybody and thought, what we'll need is a one-party state, and then when the people are ready for democracy, we'll give it to them. Kind of like Simon Bolivar in an odd sense.
I was also thinking about a explicitly Marxist Bolshevik view, because at this point, the communist and nationalist Chinese were very close to each other. The Soviet Union in the 1920s in our timeline provided a lot of support to the nationalists in their efforts to rein in these warlords. But so that's what happened. In this timeline, though, what is one of the major differences is, again, this kind of synergistic thing. You've got the fighting breaking out between Yuan Shikai's supporters and Sun Yat-sen's in 1912, 1913. What else is going on back on the other side of the world right now?
Oh, we have our first World War breaking out, this time in 1910 over the Agadir crisis.
So what happens in this timeline, the Russians, the French, the Germans, just the laundry list of everybody that got involved in the Boxer Rebellion aren't. Japan, just like it did in our timeline, basically sweeps up the German Asian possessions within a matter of months, and then has an army sitting around with nothing really to do. The thing is, in this timeline, the Europeans who might moderate Japan, who might try and keep them out of this to protect their own holdings, are a little bit more worried about, not being occupied themselves. Is that fair?
I would say that is fair, which has always been a main tension in our own timeline with Japan towards its European partners of, you guys seem more embarrassed to have an Asian coworker than you are about effectively governing China. So now we have a Japan who is more interventionist into China and is able to go even further than they had in our own timeline.
And by the way, in what country was Sun Yat-sen when things started happening back in China?
He was in exile in Japan.
And he worked very closely with Japan, didn't he?
That is correct. He was sponsored. I want to say the Black Ocean Society was his main patrons, and they were working towards a Pan-Asian view. We talked a bit about this in our first episode, but of course, whenever there's a first among equals, there has to be a first, and Japan was going to be the first.
But in this circumstance, you've got not just an expansionist Japan, but an expansionist Japan with all of the brakes off, with anybody who might check their expansion into China otherwise disposed. So they, in what we talked about, actually we didn't decide whether it would be intervention necessarily or whether it would be a lot of support, but they're going to get involved in this and make sure that their man Sun Yat-sen comes out on top of this. Is that fair?
That is correct. My bet is that probably the military would act, the army of Japan would act unilaterally. We saw this in our own timeline because the army and the navy were having a rivalry, and because they were not strictly underneath the government control, they were able to act with carte blanche. So in this one, we would see the army probably fight with Sun Yat-sen to establish control over China.
And just geographically, I think I like the mirror imaging of the Japanese army getting involved in Manchuria, because that's what they wound up doing later. That's where they actually had significant forces coming from Korea. And this is a second front to Yuan Shikai in northern China. And that could have been what essentially sealed the deal in this Chinese Civil War. Is that fair?
I would say so, yes.
So in this timeline, the Japanese are able to maybe not put a puppet, but put somebody that's friendly to them in China by 1913, 14.
Yeah, I think they would probably count this as part of like, we're helping the Allied powers. China is an ally as well. This is how we're affecting the war effort. So that way they have like a diplomatic cover. So that way at the end of the war at Versailles, they're able to legitimize this position with Sun Yat-sen giving his approval as well.
Right, because in our timeline, not long after Versailles, the Japanese started making some pretty extravagant claims, but because Europe was no longer distracted, they put the kibosh on that. So we got a Chinese situation set up. Let's jump across the world to the United States in 1912. So go ahead and talk about that a little bit, what we laid out there.
So what we have going on with the US in 1912, what we're imagining is that with the Agadir crisis raging in Europe, causing an early start to World War I. In my own notes, I keep referring this as World War Agadir for it as just a subheader. So what we're seeing in the US is that the main campaign issue is going to be about Europe, the conflict there, that's going to build up an interest. And someone who think it would just be a most bully idea to get involved is Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Taft at the time was also a proponent of getting involved with the war. And perhaps this is the thing that will allow them to bridge their differences and allow Theodore Roosevelt to become the main party leader of the Republican Party again, and is able.
So you don't think there's any chance of Roosevelt taking a second seat to Taft? I say that laughing at the idea, but I want to hear you say that too.
No way. Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt is able to trounce Woodrow Wilson. I'm imagining they would probably get a slight Republican majority, but not enough of one to declare war unilaterally. Now, the main thing that Roosevelt is going to be feared of is the fact that the open door policy in China is effectively over, especially now that Japan can say, since China and Japan are part of the Allied powers, the Entente, we do not see it that unless the US wants to get involved, they no longer will have a claim as we are conducting war operations here. And Theodore Roosevelt, who sided with the Japanese for the most part during the Russo-Japanese War, had spoken approvingly of them, saying like, yeah, they're going to be the future leaders of Japan. And he also made a deal for Japan to withhold immigration to the United States for 10 years. Whole thing. One day we'll maybe talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act and how that applied to other Asian countries, but keeping on topic, Theodore Roosevelt is ticked off. This is a slap in the face from the Japanese as far as he is concerned. And what is he going to do about it? Not much, because the Congress does not want to get involved.
Because he's still an American president, and there's only so much he can do. So he's just chomping at the bit, watching the world fall around him, and he can't do anything. But fast forward to 1916, what happened? So European war is over. Japan is solidifying control over China. What happens in that election?
Theodore Roosevelt is going to try and say we need to get involved with China and Japan and put an end to this and reestablish control. And that he's going to try and say, well, the Japanese are funneling funds to freedom fighters in the Philippines, which they were.
He would not call them freedom fighters in the Philippines.
No. But people might be as confused to think we're in the Philippines as they did when I was in my world history class. That was a whole topic of conversation of like, we had colonies in the Philippines. We never hear about that. And there's a reason why. But getting back, the public still is not going to go with it. And who is finally going to get their time in the sun? Representing the non-interventionists who want to be America first, who wants to just focus on the social issues for goodness sake. It's William Jennings Bryan who's talking about, I have a fun idea that maybe he talks about like, we really need to outlaw this teaching evolution thing. But
the thing we talked about is, and this is something that the other Eric Rush has definitely spent a good bit of time talking about, which is being president takes years off your life, especially trying to, push the boulder up the hill of trying to get the U.S. involved in Europe and in Asia. And so we actually suggested that, much like in 1920, when Woodrow Wilson was campaigning and suffered medical issues, in this timeline, Teddy Roosevelt, after receiving the Republican nomination in 1916, is out campaigning, and I believe the phrase I used was stroked out. Is that correct?
I think that would be fair to say.
So that opens the door to William Jennings Bryan, who comes in and starts, I like the America First, kind of the populism of that, right?
Right. And he was mostly involved with social issues. One of the things I found while studying up about him, I was auditioning for Inherit the Wind, which is why we talked so much about the Scopes monkey trial beforehand, is that he felt that evolution gave too much credence to the idea of eugenics, which is, if you read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, it doesn't really follow, but he felt that so many people were using it to justify eugenics, people like Theodore Roosevelt, for instance, that it was going to seriously cripple society because it's going to justify people being poor as being a natural condition for them.
Okay. So he does take on that.
He takes on that. Someone who is very upset that America will not be getting involved is our good friends, the Russians. You remember the Russians?
I remember the Russians.
I always remember the Russians. The Russians are coming, the first film appearance of Malcolm McDowell.
So go ahead and talk a little bit about what is going on with them. What is there?
Well, if you might remember from our first episode, we speculated that following the First World War, now from 1910 to 1914, that the Russians were under the leadership of a new czar. This would be Tsar Michael, who is the youngest brother of the deceased Nicholas Romanov. Who ever heard of that guy? Had some trouble with a policeman. Anyway, what ends up happening is Michael was more of a liberal and more of a progressive, and someone who is more interested in being just a constitutional monarch. So what he wants to do is he wants to take a step back from being an autocrat and let the Russian Duma, as we would call it, they would probably call it something else since he's basing it off of the Grand Duchy he had based in Finland. But he is following ideas of we'll have territory, but the territories will govern themselves. So we speculated on Poland becoming its own duchy that pays lip service to the Russian Tsar, but runs its own affairs. This would probably also happen in Constantinople, which will now become Michaelograd. And he's really just ticking everybody off. There's the Black Hundreds, who are the nationalist party who want a stronger czar back in the reins, who will allow them to go back to their pogroms of Jews and Romani people. We have Bolsheviks, who have been assisting the liberals in setting up a constitutional government, but are feeling the pressure of why haven't we started our second revolution yet, per Marx's protocol of there first being a bourgeoisie and then a socialist revolutionary group. And they're kind of being spurred on by the relative success of Spartacist Germany. And then we have people like the SRs who also want a socialist revolution, but their main idea of accomplishing it is just like, why don't we kill and assassinate more royalists? So everybody has a bone to pick with the Tsar, and whoever it is, maybe a Bolshevik, maybe a Black Hundreds, maybe an SR, he's going to end up dead by, we think, 1916 at this point.
Okay.
With probably a more conservative cousin, maybe Grand Duke Alexei being made the new czar, someone who's more malleable and will go with the Black Hundreds. And what the Black Hundreds want is an expansion into Manchuria, because the Japanese are getting way too powerful in the region, and that's just not right.
Okay. So go ahead and talk a little bit. So you've got Russia now, which is basically has settled the First World War. It's had a chance to digest some of that. It suffered the assassination of a czar and a change in political power, where some of the more conservative forces have come in. We talked about a guy who just looks like he would probably be one of the people doing this kind of thing. Roman von Ungern-Stenberg, who just, I mean, like, people Google the man. Seriously. It's, yeah.
He does look like he is the understudy for whoever the Nazi role in The Sound of Music is. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Gonna try and make sure that image is the image art for the episode art for this one, because it's a good one. So he's associated with these groups. He's kind of involved. He's important in Russia now. What else develops? What other things happen that help move this along?
What's also moving along is, and we can speculate about how much like a more reactionary government is even going to crack down on these independent duchies within their territory. But what we have going on in China, at least, they're trying to set up a federal republic, like we've discussed under Sun Yat-sen. His idea is that he wants to create a new class of yeoman farmers, basically paying tycoons off at fair market values for their land and then redistributing it to the people to create a middle class. Now, you might think this sounds like a lot of ideas that were tried by the Russians during their reform period in our timeline, and you would be correct. But it's always weird that so many industrialized countries keep trying to return to nature, like that's just the ideal, but it seems we're not very suited for it by this point. But philosophical problems aside, we have that going on. Sun Yat-sen might be chafing underneath the Japanese, but at the end of the day, in this timeline, he knows who's paying the bills. And Japan is having its own issue because in 1912, Meiji has passed away. The person who is perhaps the most representative of Japan becoming a modern power, he has died. Unfortunately, it seemed like all of his digestive tract systems decided to take him down. And his son, Taisho, as he will become known as, Emperor Taisho, has taken on. Taisho is not unintelligent, but he's kind of a fop. Like, he likes to, this is true, he likes to interject French into his conversations just willy-nilly, and it annoyed the heck out of his father, who thought he was too European, despite their whole government policy of we need to get more Europeanized, but almost comically so. He's more of a constitutional monarch like Michael was, because he's deceased now, like Michael had been modeling. And this is going to cause its own constitutional crisis, requiring the prime minister to resolve. But hopefully, with expansion into China, the political process is more streamlined. The issue is that Taisho has had meningitis since age 3. He had contracted the disease, and a few years in, he starts showing more of the advanced symptoms. He's not as mentally agile, able to focus and carry on conversations. His physical dexterity is weakening to the point to where he has trouble just opening pieces of letters that he's receiving. So in 1918, we need a regent who will become Hirohito, or Emperor Showa, as his reign was called.
Okay, so in 1918, Hirohito becomes regent, but we still have the previous emperor.
Yeah, Taisho is still the figurehead, but day-to-day operations that would require an emperor is fallen to Hirohito, who is also like his own father of, I really think it should just be the constitutional government that runs things. Unfortunately, they have a constitution that relies on an absolutist monarch. So
sounds a little familiar.
Just a tad.
So we're 1920-ish. China's developing. We've got kind of a new emperor-ish in Japan. Election
we have an
year.
Emperor in the wings.
Okay. Election year in the United States. As long as the other guy has a pulse, can a Democrat win after 1860? No. Like literally right up until the Great Depression. So what happens in the U.S. presidential election of 1920?
Well, we're still a decade from the Depression, but you and I have speculated that there might be more labor issues undermining the country because there was no labor boards, as in our own timeline, to help ease the pressure. But we're probably going to see more of an interventionist candidate, and we're probably going to see somebody who's trying to read the winds, and that is going to be Calvin Coolidge. He will narrowly beat out Warren Harding as the nominee for the Republican Party and become president. Mostly it's going to be probably because, well, he's just not as dramatic as William Jennings Bryan about everything.
And so even in this timeline, the 1920 election is a return to normalcy, right?
Yeah, they are trying to find their footing of America is being left behind because we're not involved with the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's weird to think, but yes, if you look at it a certain way, return to interventionism is normalcy in like post 1900 US policy. So Coolidge comes in and he starts pushing. He starts looking to reopen China. Is that a fair?
Yeah, he wants to open up back business interests, particularly missionary work is what he's especially interested in. It's kind of a pet project for him. And China had always held off missionaries at a distance. Now, Sun Yat-sen is more open to missionaries because he himself is a professing Christian who went to an Anglican school in Hawaii and studied there. And in fact, he has always made a big deal that, he got into trouble with his own family when he decided to convert. He destroyed a statue showing off one of the local gods of his village, and he got banished from his village because of it. So he is open to missionaries. He just doesn't want any business interest to come with it. Unfortunately, that's exactly the kind of interest Calvin Coolidge has at this time.
So what do we see developing? Kind of what are the moves that people start making when we have Coolidge trying to open up China, when we have Russia really, really not liking the Japanese right on their border, right?
Right. I think what we see is that we see the Russians get into contact with the American government and trying to work out an idea of how they can best advance both of their causes. Russia wants territory in Asia and to be seen as power. The US, Calvin Coolidge was not particularly fond of foreign entanglements, but I think in this time, he would see it as a necessity for business to get rolling along. This was the time of laissez-faire economics. And in a world where there wasn't strict controls on businesses during World War I, because again, US does not get involved this time, it's probably he has to deal with a more rampant industrialist culture that it's like, we want to get into China and get just, that's where the money is.
So you're saying there's a convention, there's an alliance, there's a, hey, we both don't like Japan agreement between the United States and whatever form Russia has at this point?
That is correct. I think
And,
Russia is still nominally has a parliamentary system in place, because a lot of times with strongmen, they still want to keep up the illusion. It's why the Roman emperors could never really say, oh, we're an empire. They always had to play it off as, I am a servant of the Senate who's just keeping my hands on the scale of power.
And by the way, this is probably also pretty important for the United States. Even in our timeline, the end of the Romanovs, I was talking earlier about the busy time frames, busy couple of months in history. And it was something very important for the United States when the February Revolution happened in Russia. It almost gave them a bit of a green light to get involved, because we're no longer fighting, now we can say we're fighting for democracy. You can't say you're fighting for democracy when you're on the same side as the Tsar. So the Russian Republic at this point keeping some of those forms in place, it's probably important for them being an acceptable ally to the US, right?
Right.
So this forms, and I think we discussed Coolidge comes in 1920. He starts building up. By 1922-ish, they've done some work. The United States is ready, and reminiscent of some of the late 1930s adventures along the Manchurian border, Russia organizes an incident that escalates. Is that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was also going to suggest another pretext that the US could use is like, we have found evidence of Japan sending money to Filipino independence fighters, and that becoming another flashpoint.
Okay. So it gets real. It gets real pretty quick, right?
Right. Now, so this is a Russian military that fundamentally has fared somewhat better in the First World War. They've been able to modernize somewhat. So they're probably have an early advantage. The fighting is going to mostly be in Manchuria, I would imagine, for the ground forces, because the US will be taking up naval encounters. But the further that they get in, they're also going to be dealing with China, who now also has a war going on in their northern borders because they have this alliance with Japan. They also do not want the Russians in their territory any further at all. So we are probably going to see two forces, both relatively on the same scale. I imagine it would eventually descend into more guerrilla warfare, considering there has been largely a civil war going on in China, though Japan might make up for more traditional military forms. How well do you think we will be seeing the Russian military fare against the combined efforts of the Chinese and Japanese?
Steamroll. I think it looks similar to what you see in 1945, in August 1945. You've got a Russian military that has been playing in the big leagues. And you've got a Japanese military that honestly has not. They like to think that they're first class, and they did gain very important experience in 1905. And they rested on those laurels. The Japanese army did not really fight in World War I. If you look even in our timeline, what they did in 1940, 41, 42 it's basically the French strategy in 1914. This idea of spirit and elan and very basic equipment being able to carry you. That doesn't work very well when you're facing a modern military that is used to putting up the kind of material support that it took to fight an industrialized First World War. And in this timeline, Russia's used to that. And not only is it used to that, it kept a lot of that institutional memory within itself rather than, purging it. But I'm open to what you think.
My kind of thought is I think it would be more of a replay of the Russo-Japanese War, but my reasoning is that both the Russian military culture and the Japanese military culture that we see in our own timeline both do not have a high regard for troop containment. Both are very keen of like, yes, we have the reserves, we will use as many people as we can, which is what got them both into trouble of just, for the Russians, it was material and leadership. For the Japanese, it was really a manpower shortage. because when you institutionalize the idea of never surrender, or surrender is the most shameful thing ever, and that it is better to die than admit defeat, which again, you can trace culturally to a nation that was essentially in a 200-year civil war coming out of that, it's going to create issues. China is probably going to have to fill in the most. I do see a lot of guerrilla fighting, so it's more inconclusive. I think the Russians are able to cover a lot of ground, but I think it will stall out at some point.
Do you think that the Chinese nationalists have support in Manchuria? I'm specifically thinking about the Manchus and kind of a what you see a lot today in China is a Han chauvinism. Even though Sun Yat-sen was pushing for a federal state, do you think you see some of that Han chauvinism where they maybe don't even look at the Manchus as countrymen and the Manchus don't look at them as countrymen, which kind of changes the environment in which the Russians are operating?
I think the fact that Sun Yat-sen had tried to federalize, but it was still having issues. Sun Yat-sen himself had a darker complexion and always tried to play that up of like, I am fighting for all of us, and I am ethnically, I don't know if he himself was ethnically Han or didn't consider himself so. I'd have to do some more research, but that we do have these ethnic fault lines that we found in Eastern Europe following the First World War in our own timeline. But in this case, I do see it as the Chinese are fine with the Manchus getting overrun by the Russians, but I think once the Russians go past that, they then have to immediately respond.
And I'm not even sure if China gets involved, as long as Russia stays up there in Manchuria.
I don't know how much Russia will stay up there, though, especially if they have the US egging them on, and the US's stated goal is we want an open China again.
I think the United States in this, though, just wants to take Japan down a peg. So taking Manchuria and some islands from them takes them down a peg.
Right.
Because what the United States doesn't want, the whole open door policy was, we don't want a dominant power in China. That's what we're trying to keep. We will let the French, we will let the Germans, the Italians, the Portuguese, the British, everybody can have a part. Nobody dominates it. Russia and Japan are the two powers that could dominate it because they're next door.
Right.
Nobody honestly thinks the Portuguese Empire is going to come out of Macau and take over.
But there is an empire in China who does have a vested interest and an alliance with the Japanese, and it is the British from their base of operations in Hong Kong, and they are very concerned about the
and
American
Singapore and Southern Pacific, Solomons, Australia, New Zealand, all of this area. They're concerned about fighting in general in the Pacific. They want peace because that means they can trade opium. So, go ahead.
So what we would probably see is, I think the US Navy, I think it would be off to a rough start, just because the Japanese at least have more experience and the US Navy has had its first major buildup. In this case, in 2 decades, essentially. Like we saw some armament leading up to the First World War in our own timeline, but not as much following the First World War.
And the other thing is, it's a matter of that experience. It's
Exactly.
a matter of actually crewing those ships and actually fighting, which Japan had done. Much like I was just saying about the Russian army, they've done it. Japan hadn't. Japanese Navy has.
So I definitely think the Japanese would fare better at sea, than they have on land.
Okay.
I think the land question will be how much it will fall down to China to do the fighting with the Russians if the Russians do not have a clear strategy of stop in Manchuria,
Okay.
which was, as a side note, just kind of what Germany was hoping the Austrians would do of stopping in Belgrade and just declaring an early victory. So we're putting a lot of faith that everybody is able to stick to a plan, and very pessimistic about that chance. So America and the Japanese fight in the Navy. The British get called in by the Japanese, by their agents in Hong Kong and in India and in the South Pacific. And they start to make overtures to both Russia and the US saying, you really need to cut this out. This is destabilizing the region.
So Britain kind of puts its fingers on the scales here, a lot like the United States did in 1905-06. And what's kind of the settlement we see coming out of this?
I think what we would see as the settlement is, I think Manchuria would fall under the Russian influence. They probably reestablish Puyi, which is something that Sun Yat-sen had always was one of the main things he did not want to see. He did not want to see the restoration of the Qing, especially after Sun Yat-sen had been kidnapped by Qing agents in England and then saw many of his comrades be assassinated by the Qing during the lead up to the Civil War in China. So Puyi is made the nominal figurehead of Manchuria. Keeping with Michael's system, this might be the last time that the Russians are willing to have an independent duchy, but I think we would probably see that as the beginning of the end for that system, with the Russians wanting to fully make themselves clearly the heads of the governments. That can be a topic for another time. The US probably does get some islands in the Pacific as a bargaining of, we will grant you territory that you can administrate over. The open door policy of China is still going to be a question. I don't think it's going to be fully open. The US might be able to have some businesses move in, but I think it's mostly going to stay as a Japanese vassal at this time. What is your...
I don't know. I think that Sun Yat-sen, any nationalist, welcomes the opportunity to be a nationalist. When your patron, is somewhat shaken, when they're in a situation of, gee, they're not the top dog anymore, or maybe I could kind of play somebody off against them. I think the Sun Yat-sen, who, again, had close Japanese ties, but also had close American ties, might cozy up to the United States and play the two sides against each other for the benefit of Chinese independence.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So China is able to win itself kind of a sense of independence from Japan.
Right.
Still playing the role of like, yeah, we're your junior partner, we support you. But we have to work with the US. We just have to. That's to avoid another war.
Right. So that's kind of, is that the situation we've got? And do we think this is a good stopping off point? We promised not to keep going down this. We did say this is a 3-parter. I think this is a good third part, right?
I think so. I think we have enough material for our own novel at this point about this alternate timeline.
I will go ahead and promise the next episode you hear is not going to be this. We're going to come up with something else, I promise you. But we definitely kind of thought about a couple of different places where we could spin some other things from this, right?
Right.
So maybe we're not. Maybe this isn't the end of this one. Go ahead.
Well, let's just say for right now, it's 1926. Manchuria is a sphere of influence of the revigorated Russian Empire, which is ever so near teetering to internal strife as it decides to assert a sense of nationalism over its independent territories. We have a Japan that has been chastened somewhat. They still have nominal control over Korea. They still have an influence in China, but that is growing more distant. We have a Chinese Federal Republic being led by Sun Yat-sen, who we will see if he will keep to his own term limits or if he will feel the need to expand his power base. We have a US that has much of a less, they have a much more diminished effect in world affairs at this point and trying to see how they can match up. We see a British Empire that at least is more involved in the Asian Pacific than it has been. And in 1926, we see Hirohito being crowned the emperor after the passing of his father Taisho from his complications with meningitis. And maybe we see a few of the powers there at a very awkward ceremony, seeing the emperor being crowned. And everything is just waiting to flare up again. Or not.
Yeah, and it's not like we left Europe all settled, right, last time?
No.
So, for the rest of the A Fork in Time cast, this is Chris and Eric telling everyone, if you should come to a fork in the road, what should one do?
Take it.
All right. We look forward to spending some time with you guys later on. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.